Join me in welcoming Tim Baack, President and CEO, DeShanda Williams-Clark, Senior Vice President of Programs and Services, and Renee Kirnberger, Senior Vice President of Development and Communications, to the stage for a discussion on LGBTQ plus youth homelessness. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us share some more about these issues that our young people face. This is some of our most enjoyable and heartbreaking pieces of what we get to do, is to share these experiences and carry youth voice forward in these spaces and advocate for them. So I will ask Tim and DeShanda some questions. Let's start. Both of you can take this first question, which is, share some of the reasons why LGBTQ plus young people experience disproportionately higher rates of homelessness than their heterosexual peers.
Do you want to start?
Sure.
Ooh.
From my experience working with young people, there's a number of reasons, and namely, society just hasn't made the amount of progress that we may think. Sometimes when I'm at Pathfinders, I forget that the world outside of those walls is still pretty homophobic and oppressive, and that there are still so many adults that just aren't as accepting of the young people that are in their lives and their identities and their preferences, and are not as supportive. And so many young people are identifying feeling unsafe in those environments, as Denise has spoken about earlier. What we may feel is their home, they may feel is an unsafe environment simply because they may choose to dress differently, they may choose to have a different name or pronoun, and just the way they prefer to be addressed, or their preference and attraction even, is just, they face a lot of discrimination inside of their homes, with families, at school, and employment, and in other places in our world, in our city, just in our neighborhoods. There's youth aging out of or experiencing foster care in those systems where sometimes that the training and the cultural responsiveness just isn't there, and so there's still folks that still need that that cultural inclusivity to understand that there are young people developmentally just outside of LGBTQ identities that are still learning and figuring out who they are. And so on that spectrum, that is still inclusive of that. There's also financial and emotional manipulation and neglect, where young people just aren't getting their basic and immediate needs met, and some of that is social emotional support and relationships, and just having folks that are just kind and respectful and graceful to them. And so on a regular basis, where young people are supposed to be supported and loved and have guidance and adults in their lives that care about them and take care of them, they're just not experiencing that. As a lot of us may be here, may have had those experiences, young people that are on the LGBTQ plus spectrum are facing more of those oppressive, adultist, ageist, and homophobic ways that society still perpetuates.
What I would add to that is Pathfinders has been in this community for nearly 55 years, and from the very beginning as an organization, I think there was a recognition of something we still talk about, unfortunately, because we have to this very day, which is disproportionality. And we see that in so many different ways in terms of the youth and young adults and families who come to us for support and for assistance. The companion piece to disproportionality is vulnerability. And I think from the very beginning, there was a recognition that there was an elevated or a heightened vulnerability that was evidenced by queer identified young people who were somewhere on that spectrum of either gender identity or sexual orientation, that by nature of who they were or who they were becoming increased the likelihood that they were going to experience not only significant trauma, but also an elevated likelihood of getting their basic needs not met. And housing is one of those most basic needs. And so I think as an inclusive organization relative to LGBTQ plus identified individuals, that's always been at the heart and at the soul of the work that we've done. And I think, Q Block was one of those programmatic efforts early on that was an opportunity that we created to really evidence our doubling down on the need for tailored and specific services that really attended to the particular needs of queer young people experiencing homelessness and housing instability.
Thank you. When we, Tim, when you were working toward creating, like imagining and creating Q Block 15, 20 years ago, when folks were coming together to really make this a targeted effort, what did the landscape look like in the shelter and housing space, organizationally, in our community? What did resources look like? How did they feel for young people?
I'll be real honest, I don't think anyone was really aware of or willing to talk about what the needs were. I remember one of those earlier conversations with Maria, who was the executive director of Cream City, back 15 plus years ago, to really sort of look at what were those specific issues that we're facing, not just queer identified young people, but the systems that are there ideally to support them, but more often than not ended up either exploiting or failing them. And I think from those earlier conversations, it became very clear that we needed to do something different, not just as an organization relative to specialized housing support and resources that were geared toward the experiences of queer identified young people, but also to look at the systems change that was needed across our community relative to homelessness and housing instability. We had heard time and again the failure of the system as it existed to be able to be welcoming and affirming for people to show up as their genuine selves. And I think that is particularly acute and unfortunately still exists for queer folks in general, for trans-identified young people in particular. What this opportunity between our partnership with Cream City Foundation and some of the other partners that were joining us early in this week work, what that really involved was looking at how do we not only build a tailored program, but how do we affect systemic change? How do we help other organizations where queer people are going to show up, where they can be safely housed and served? And that's an ongoing part of our work. So the landscape has improved considerably, but I don't want to mislead people. There is still a lot of work that still needs to be done so that people can be their true, authentic self and show up in that way and not be afraid of being denied services or not getting the quality of services that they genuinely need.
DeShanda, from your 10 plus years of work at Pathfinders, where do you see the broader community service spectrum looking like for queer youth?
I would say that unfortunately it depends on the political climate sometimes, because depending on what's going on at the higher, more macro level, sometimes we can't even identify that we're looking for resources and services for folks on the queer spectrum, because those are buzzwords that may eliminate us, or we won't get approved for certain funding because it cannot be specific to the LGBTQ plus community. And so we have partners like, Diverse and Resilient, the LGBT Community Center, Forge. So there are community-based agencies that have been consistent and have been progressive in continuing to provide those specialized services to our community. And they've been around for a long time. And it would be nice to see those type of resources, that type of support grow in our community. But it seems like it lays in the hands of the same people, the same folks. And so it would be ideal that at the macro level, at the federal and governmental levels, that we would be able to advocate more clearly, explicitly, that queer young people deserve resources because they've been disproportionately discriminated against and oppressed over time. We know that this is a community that has been fighting for their rights forever, since folks have been able to come out or not come out. And there's still legislation over 500 pieces of legislation is being introduced on trans individuals, and over 100 of those legislative policies are harmful to the trans community. And we're constantly in our city seeing the death of queer individuals, and specifically trans individuals, at high rates, because there's still this stigma, there's still this level of feeling unsafe, unsheltered, and these intersecting identities. It's not just being a queer individual, but there's also being a person of color, there's also gender identity, there's poverty, there's so many things that contribute to what the landscape looks like. And so if more of us can advocate at those higher levels, or those of us that are in power positions can ensure that we're improving the policies, we're improving the community-based organizations and the resources, so that we can really pull in this community and elevate them and empower them, so they're not continuing to be the people that are oppressed and facing that level of discrimination, but they deserve to have a long, successful life just like their heterosexual counterparts.
You know, and I would just, if I could add to that, because DeShanda, you mentioned something so important. The people in power matter. And we learned as an organization very quickly that we had to reframe the work that we do at the federal level under the prior president and prior administration, because we learned very quickly if we were open in our language about serving queer identified young people, that we would be automatically vetted out of consideration for funding. And that's a horrible thing for me to have to say in this day and age, that that's what was going on at the federal level. And we see that, and DeShanda noted the pieces of legislation at the federal level, the state level, the local level, that continue to perpetuate discrimination and bias and hate toward members of our community who identify as LGBTQ+. That continues to be a challenge for us as an organization and for us as a community and as a country. I would love to be able to be sitting here and saying, we've won that battle. But the reality is the battle continues to go on. And as an organization, you know, when we talk about empowering youth and changing lives, we also recognize deeply at our core that in order to affect meaningful change in the lives of young people, we need to continue to advocate for systems level change so that they are not disproportionately impacted by issues of homelessness and housing instability and the whole myriad of discrimination that continues to affect the quality of their lives.
Thank you. So the systems change, speaking truth to power, using your voice. That's what I just heard a lot of from their responses. You had the opportunity tonight to walk around the room and meet a bunch of our staff, and one of the things you were also invited to do was, this is where we're calling you in to our work. We're inviting you in to become change makers, and so that we can share that voice and amplify that voice of what's needed. If you didn't sign up today to help us extend our reach, to help us extend the voice of our young people to our elected officials and say what kind of community do we want and how do we want our community members to be treated, please consider visiting Pathfinders mke.org and checking out our Changemakers page. It is often only takes 5 or 10 voices for an elected official to be moved into feeling like some action needs to be taken, oftentimes. So I think we all sit and think sometimes, oh, I'm just one person, I don't have the power to do anything. And we'd like to help you change that feeling. So please consider that. So thank you. I want to go back a little bit to how did you take Q Block, this one niche housing program specifically for LGBTQ+ and allied youth, and turn it into a really robust program? How did that evolution come about?
Well, to be honest, that wasn't sort of the plan at first. And I got to give credit for to the leadership and the board of the Cream City Foundation at that time. They came to us and said, we see a need that we want to help support your efforts to address. And at that time, they were going through their own strategic planning, and they made, I think, a really important, and I recognize a really difficult decision at that moment, which was to double down and invest to a greater degree in one initiative, in one organization, to see what that impact would look like. And so their decision to do that ultimately served as a catalyst for us as an organization to not only pilot Q-Block our original plan was to pilot it at a very small scale, to serve 5 youth for 1 year and really see what worked. And their support coincided with federal resources through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act under President Obama at the time that made us shift or pivot very quickly from a pilot program of 5 youth to a full-scale, fully robust program serving 25 young people within a matter of several months. And that for us was a pretty steep learning curve. But in that opportunity, what they did in their investment was they served as a catalyst for us to learn from what we were looking at doing with Q-Block and modifying it along the way to developing a model that has proven to be effective for youth regardless of how they identify. And from that early beginning with Q-Block, we now have a robust portfolio of more than 6 different housing initiatives for youth and young adults aged 25 and under. And we have learned a lot over the years. It's a little embarrassing to say in some respects, but I think it's important to acknowledge. In our first year of Q-Block, we weren't really doing what is now known as Housing First. We really thought, let's just give young people a year of support and they'll be ready to successfully launch on their own, and then we'll move on. And that actually worked for some young people, but we quickly learned it was not a one-size-fits-all. And so from those early beginnings, we have learned to do a genuine Housing First model of putting housing before anything else, for making that housing unconditional as a basic human right, and to help young people, regardless of the duration of the amount of time they need, to really tailor their supports in ways that work for them. And so from that first Q-Block model, we have now replicated that and built upon that in all of the supported housing work that we do. And we have impacted the lives of hundreds of young people, and for many of them, their children as well, in the 15 years since we launched Q-Block.
This is the part where I get to brag. I get to try and get us to brag a little bit. I don't know if you've noticed, Pathfinders tends to be a little bit humble. I'm kind of a big mouth. So it's a nice marriage between the two. So Tim, will you share just a little bit? I believe that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as affectionately as HUD, has acknowledged Pathfinders for its work. Will you talk about that, please?
Sure. And this was in the first couple of years of running Q-Block for us, and as we were building that portfolio of supported housing that I just mentioned, HUD chose Pathfinders as one of 4 programs nationally as a model or evidence-based program relative to what is now called rapid rehousing, which is a particular approach to do an intensive array of services that are comprehensive and individually tailored to shorten the duration of time that an individual needs relative to ongoing housing support. It's really a launching pad for individuals to get stabilized, to get reoriented, and to be able to not need lifelong support relative to housing or other basic needs. And so it was a pretty big honor for us back in the day for HUD to select us as one of 4 of those organizations to be nationally profiled as an evidence-based model program for how to do this kind of work. And we were the only program that really focused on, at that time, queer identified young adults or youth emerging into young adulthood.
Thank you for that. Now, DeShanda, tell us, she's like, what is she gonna ask him? You know the question. How can the broader community better support unhoused LGBTQ young people?
I think it's important to be mindful of the positions you hold in the community, whether as an employer, as a realtor or landlord, as a neighbor, as a family member, that you have to do the work to be graceful, to be respectful, and to be kind, to learn what it means to meet people where they are, to, if you don't understand or if things are unclear or uncomfortable for you, to reach out to those organizations and those leaders in the community that can be recognized for showing that type of support and advocacy for the queer community. It is our responsibility and our duty as adults, as community members, to grow and to learn as times progress. We cannot stay in the past, we cannot live there, but we can learn from that, and then we can become something new. We can grow into something better. We have to recognize that the young people that are interfacing with these issues and that are facing these challenges are our future leaders, realtors, employers, and all of that. And we want to invest in them in really positive and healthy ways, and so that those that are coming after them can also get that support. Together, we can end what it means to feel like you're disproportionately facing these quality of life issues, or that you're oppressed, or you're facing these intersecting challenges when it comes to not only just being a queer person, being a person that is queer and that is a person of color, that may be facing some mental health challenges, that is trying to get their income and meet their basic needs. I think that we have to do the work to be able to empower and improve the state of our society today. And again, partnering with agencies that are doing the work. And I was on a panel earlier today, and they were asking, like, well, sometimes we see folks outside, we see folks panhandling, we see students that are friends with our kids and they need a place to stay. It is our responsibility to show them grace, to give them choice and give them autonomy and what a safe space and supportive adults look like for them. Again, ending that adultism where we are the ones that saying, you as kids, you as children or young people, y'all need to do what we say. And I think that we can all agree that that has not been the best approach thus far for many of us in this room. And if you are a person that has had support growing up, you have had the ability to be able to make mistakes. And I'm telling you that the young people that we see coming into Pathfinders, they are targeted, they are attacked, they are manipulated, they are coerced. They're getting things on their background just because they're surviving and trying to meet their own basic needs. And what we can do is provide a better and safer support for them, and giving them choice in what it means to have a family, what it means to live in certain areas, and respect and hear what they're saying. Don't call them a liar. Listen to what they're saying and be able to meet them where they are.
So extend that hand, be willing to receive and take your friend's call when someone reaches out to you. Evolve, learn, and grow like the characters in The Wizard of Oz. And show love and respect to one another. We've got some really cool themes we're vibing on tonight, everybody. Yeah. Tim, is there anything you wanted to add? I can't tell. Your mic is still green. I never really know. You don't have to, but just do.
I just love the theme of there's no place like home. I mean, I think it's at the core of the work that we do at Pathfinders. The reality is housing discrimination, although illegal, continues to exist and continues to disproportionately impact queer identified individuals in this community and across the country. And it's because of that youth find themselves in situations where they are exploited, where that vulnerability that they are experiencing is taken advantage of, that DeShanda, I think, so powerfully just noted. And the reality is it doesn't have to be that way. And it's really through your collective support and your individual engagement, whether it's at an advocacy level or at an organizational support level, that you are making a really important difference in the lives of young people. Queer identified or otherwise. And I think that's a really important thing to take to heart, because sometimes it feels like problems are so intractable that there are no solutions. And I have always said, and always find the need to repeat, homelessness is a solvable problem. You solve it by giving individuals housing. And then you build from there. And that's something that I think Pathfinders has taken to heart and does exceptionally well for the hundreds and thousands of young people and their families whose lives we touch each and every year.
And the last topic is heavy, and it's current, and it's tough, and it's scary. It's really, really scary for our young people, for our community, for everyone across the U.S. who's potentially experiencing any kind of homelessness. Right now, the Supreme Court is listening to a case on homelessness. Tim, would you contextualize City of Grand Pass, Oregon versus Johnson that is being heard by the Supreme Court right now?
Sure. Oral arguments have been presented to the Supreme Court, and at its core, what we're talking about is a community in a different part of this country and their efforts, and unfortunately, they're not unique in this regard, but it's their case that has made its way to the Supreme Court. They have decided that the way to address homelessness is to criminalize that experience. And so the case before the Supreme Court really is an argument about whether communities, whether jurisdictions, whether municipalities have the right to address the housing instability and homeless experience of an individual through criminalization, fines, and through jail, when in fact the reality is these are communities where individuals are sleeping in public areas or on the streets and visible in their homeless experience because there are no housing alternatives available to them, whether that's emergency shelter housing, interim housing, or permanent supportive housing. So by no fault of their own, by experiencing homelessness, we have a community on the west coast of the country who has said, we're going to attend to this by fining them, by jailing them, and by criminalizing the experience of homelessness. So the case before the Supreme Court is really important. And locally, we took an issue as an organization through our work and leadership with Shelter and Transitional Housing Task Force, which has been active in this community for decades, back in 2016. And we put out a position saying the criminalization of homelessness does not solve the experience of homelessness. There are ways to end homelessness, and there are proven strategies and evidence-based approaches that with sufficient resources do a much better job of addressing what communities experience when they see homeless individuals in public areas. It is a call to action because the ramifications should the Supreme Court allow this community to go ahead and allow for the criminalization of homelessness for those experiencing that housing instability, that has profound implications for communities across the country. So it really is a call to action. And we are hoping through the galvanized support of some of our national partners and local organizations like Pathfinders and others, joining in support of alternatives to criminalization as the way to address and end homelessness.